Welcome to the Sleepy Stoic. Tonight, we open a private journal written by the most powerful man in the world. These are not speeches intended for the Senate, not declarations meant for history, not philosophy crafted for an audience. These are the private thoughts of Marcus Aurelius, Roman emperor, written in the quiet spaces between battles and governance, between judgments and ceremonies. Written, perhaps, in a military tent on the frontier, or in a rare moment of solitude within the palace walls. The text we know as the Meditations was never meant for us. Carries no grand title assigned by its author. Marcus did not write these reflections to teach others, to establish a school of thought, or to secure his legacy as a philosopher. He wrote them for himself. These pages contain the inner dialogue of a man trying to remain good, trying to remain sane, trying to remain human while bearing responsibilities that would crush most souls. Imagine this. You rule an empire that spans from Britain to the deserts of Mesopotamia, from the Rhine to Egypt. Millions of lives depend on your decisions. Generals await your commands. Senators plot in your shadow. Barbarian tribes press against your borders. Plague spreads through your cities. And in the midst of all this chaos, all this power, all this noise, you sit down with a journal and remind yourself that you are mortal, that your opinion is merely opinion, that the universe is change and life is perspective. This is the profound paradox we explore tonight. The man with absolute power over the known world using that power most significantly on himself. The emperor who could command anything, choosing instead to command his own thoughts, his own reactions, his own character. Marcus Aurelius possessed the authority to reshape nations, yet devoted his deepest attention to reshaping his own mind. We often speak of philosophy as if it were an achievement, a destination, a body of knowledge to be mastered and displayed. But the Meditations reveal something more honest and more human. They show us philosophy as a daily practice, a constant returning, a discipline that never reaches completion because life never stops testing us. Marcus did not write these thoughts because he had attained perfect Stoic wisdom. He wrote them because he needed reminding. Every day he needed reminding. In these hours together, we will move slowly through the inner world of this philosopher king. We will not rush through his ideas as if checking items off a list. Instead, we will dwell in them, turn them over, let them settle into understanding. We will explore what it meant to practice Stoicism not in the comfortable detachment of a philosophical school, but in the crushing midst of empire, war, plague, and political intrigue. The Meditations offer us something rare in ancient philosophy. Most philosophical texts come to us polished, structured, intended for students or posterity. But Marcus's journal is different. It circles back to the same themes repeatedly, not because he forgot what he wrote before, but because he needed to hear these truths again. It contradicts itself occasionally, not from confusion, but from the honest fluctuation of a mind grappling with reality. It reveals frustration, weariness, determination renewed, hope restored. It is philosophy in real time under real pressure. This is not the voice of a sage dispensing wisdom from a mountaintop. This is the voice of a man in the arena, covered in the dust of living, reminding himself how to stand. And perhaps that is precisely why Marcus Aurelius speaks to us so powerfully across the centuries. We hear in his words not perfect wisdom achieved, but earnest wisdom pursued. We recognize ourselves in his struggles because they remain our struggles, dressed in different circumstances but identical in essence. Before we enter deeply into the Meditations themselves, we should understand who wrote them and when. Marcus Aurelius was born in 121 CE, into a world already centuries old in its power. Rome had long since transformed from republic to empire. The Pax Romana, the Roman peace, had brought unprecedented stability across the Mediterranean world. It was an age of relative prosperity, of grand architecture, of cultural confidence. Marcus was not born into the imperial family, but his family was wealthy and well-connected. He was noticed early for his serious temperament, his love of learning, his natural inclination toward philosophy. The Emperor Hadrian saw something in the boy and arranged for his eventual succession. When Hadrian's own successor Antoninus Pius adopted Marcus, the path to imperial power was set. But that path included something unusual for a Roman emperor. Marcus was given the finest education available, studying rhetoric, literature, law, and philosophy. More significantly, he developed a deep devotion to Stoicism, the philosophical school that would define his inner life. His teachers introduced him to the works of Epictetus, the former slave who had become one of Stoicism's most powerful voices. In Epictetus, Marcus found not abstract theory but practical wisdom about how to live. When Marcus became emperor in 161 CE at the age of 40, he inherited not the peaceful realm he might have expected, but an empire in crisis. The Parthian Empire threatened Rome's eastern borders, requiring immediate military response. Soon after, Germanic tribes began pressing against the northern frontiers. Then came something worse than any military threat. In 165 CE, soldiers returning from the east brought with them a devastating plague, likely smallpox, that would kill millions across the empire over the following decades. Marcus spent much of his reign on military campaigns, living in camps along the Danube frontier, far from the comforts of Rome. It was likely in these camps, in the cold northern territories, that he wrote much of what we now call the Meditations. Picture him in his tent, perhaps at night after a day of military decisions and political negotiations, taking up his journal to remind himself of what truly matters. The text we have was written in Greek, not Latin. This detail tells us something important. Greek was the language of philosophy in the Roman world. By writing in Greek, Marcus was perhaps placing himself mentally in the tradition of the Greek Stoics, speaking to himself in the language of philosophy rather than the language of power. Latin was the language of laws, commands, and imperial decrees. Greek was the language of thought, reflection, and wisdom. Marcus ruled as emperor until his death in 180 CE, likely also from plague while still on campaign. He had been emperor for 19 years, and much of that time had been spent in warfare, plague management, and administrative crisis. The private journal he kept throughout these years was preserved, probably by those who went through his possessions after his death. At some point, it acquired the Greek title Taies Houton, which means to himself. Later translators gave it the name by which we know it, the Meditations. The book is divided into 12 sections, probably representing 12 different notebooks or periods of writing. It does not follow a logical progression from beginning to end. Instead, it circles around core themes, returning to fundamental Stoic principles again and again. This structure reflects its nature as a private journal. Marcus was not building an argument for readers. He was reminding himself, working through difficulties, renewing his commitment to living philosophically. What makes the Meditations so compelling is this intimate quality. We are reading over the shoulder of an emperor as he struggles with the same questions we struggle with. How do I deal with difficult people? How do I face mortality? How do I maintain perspective when everything feels overwhelming? How do I stay true to my principles when circumstances push against them? These are not the questions of an ancient world alone. They are the questions of every human life. At the heart of Stoicism, and therefore at the heart of Marcus's practice, lies a simple but profound insight. Most of our suffering comes not from events themselves, but from our judgments about events. The Stoics taught that we do not control what happens to us, but we do control how we respond to what happens. This distinction, this dichotomy of control, forms the foundation of all Stoic wisdom. Epictetus, whose teachings deeply influenced Marcus, expressed this principle bluntly. Some things are up to us, and some things are not up to us. Up to us are our own thoughts, intentions, desires, and aversions. Not up to us are our bodies, our possessions, our reputations, our positions in society. Everything we suffer, Epictetus taught, comes from confusing these two categories, from trying to control what we cannot control and neglecting what we can. This teaching might sound simple, even obvious, but living it is the work of a lifetime. Marcus understood this. Throughout the meditations, we see him returning to this basic principle, reminding himself again and again to focus on what lies within his control. Not because he had forgotten the principle, but because life kept tempting him to forget it. Consider what was not in Marcus's control. He could not control the plague that ravaged his empire. He could not control the Germanic tribes that pressed against his borders. He could not control the ambitious senators who conspired in Rome. He could not control the weaknesses in his own body as illness and age took their toll. He could not even control his own son Commodus, who would later prove to be a disastrous emperor, undoing much of his father's work. What remained in his control? His response to the plague, to the military threats, to the political challenges. His decision about how to interpret events, how to judge his own role, how to meet each day. His commitment to virtue, to justice, to wisdom. His inner dialogue, his perspective, his character. This was his domain, and he worked in it constantly. The Stoics taught that virtue is the only true good and vice the only true evil. Everything else, they said, is indifferent. This does not mean that health, wealth, and reputation do not matter at all. The Stoics were not so naive. They recognized that some indifferents are preferred and some are dispreferred. We would prefer to be healthy rather than sick, prosperous rather than impoverished, honored rather than scorned. But these things are not good in themselves because they can be used badly. Wealth can fund cruelty. Health can support tyranny. Reputation can mask corruption. True good, the Stoics argued, lies only in virtue, in the proper use of our capacity for choice. This is why a slave like Epictetus could be truly free while an emperor could be truly enslaved. Freedom is not about external circumstances, but about internal governance. The person who rules their own mind is free regardless of their chains. The person enslaved by desires and fears is a prisoner regardless of their throne. Marcus had every external advantage. He possessed absolute power, immense wealth, and the highest honor the Roman world could offer. Yet he used these advantages primarily to practice virtue under extremely difficult circumstances. He understood that his wealth did not make him good, his power did not make him wise, and his position did not make him free. Only his choices could do that. Only his commitment to reason, justice, courage, and self-discipline could make him truly excellent. This is the first great paradox of Marcus Aurelius. The man who had everything external treated external things as nearly nothing. The man who controlled an empire focused his greatest effort on controlling himself. He reminds us that power and possessions, while not evil in themselves, are not the point of life. The point of life is to become good, to develop our character, to live according to nature and reason. When Marcus wrote to himself about living according to nature, he meant something specific that we must understand to grasp Stoic philosophy. The Stoics believed that the universe itself is rational, ordered by what they called logos, a divine reason that pervades all things. To live according to nature means to align ourselves with this rational order, to accept what the universe provides, and to fulfill our role within the cosmic whole. But human nature is also part of nature, and our nature is rational and social. We are creatures capable of reason, and we are creatures who live in communities. Therefore, living according to nature means developing our rationality and fulfilling our social bonds. It means thinking clearly, acting justly, and contributing to the common good. This is not something we do after we achieve power or wealth or security. This is what we do with whatever circumstances we find ourselves in. Marcus did not choose to be emperor any more than we choose to be born into our particular circumstances. The Stoics taught that the role we play matters less than how we play it. Whether we are emperor or farmer, merchant or soldier, parent or child, the question is always the same. Are we fulfilling our role with virtue? Are we acting with wisdom, justice, courage, and self-discipline in the circumstances we actually face? This perspective liberated Marcus from both pride and resentment. He could not take pride in being emperor because that was not his achievement. It was a role assigned by fate, by the cosmic order, by circumstances beyond his control. But neither could he resent the burden of that role, wishing he were somewhere else, doing something else. The universe had placed him here in this position at this time. His task was not to wish for a different role, but to perform this role virtuously. Throughout the meditations, we see Marcus reminding himself of this cosmic perspective. He zooms out from his immediate concerns to see himself as a small part of a vast whole. He imagines looking down from above at the earth, seeing the cities and armies as tiny marks on an immense sphere. He reminds himself that he is one human among billions who have lived, a brief moment in an incomprehensible span of time. This is not meant to diminish human life, but to place it in proper perspective. When we see ourselves as part of something larger, our personal anxieties and ambitions shrink to their true size. The insult that seemed so devastating, the honor we craved so desperately, the fear that consumed our thoughts, all of these appear smaller when viewed from the perspective of nature as a whole. This does not mean they do not matter. It means they matter differently. They matter as part of the larger pattern, not as the whole pattern itself. The Stoic cosmology might seem strange to us now. We do not necessarily believe in a divine logos pervading the universe. We understand nature through different frameworks, through evolutionary biology and physical laws rather than through divine reason. But the practical insight remains powerful. We are part of something larger than ourselves. Our lives unfold within systems we did not create and cannot fully control. Our task is not to rebel against this reality, but to find our proper role within it. Marcus understood that even his absolute power was relative. He ruled Rome, but Rome itself was subject to time and change. The empire would not last forever. Nothing lasts forever. Even the memory of his rule would eventually fade into obscurity. The Stoics taught that all things are in flux, constantly changing, constantly flowing away. Nothing we build is permanent. Nothing we achieve is eternal. This awareness of impermanence, far from leading to despair, led Marcus toward freedom. If nothing external lasts, then nothing external is worth sacrificing virtue to obtain or preserve. If even the Roman Empire is temporary, then certainly one man's reputation is temporary, One man's life is temporary, one man's pleasures and pains are temporary. What matters is how we live in the brief span we have. What matters is the quality of our character and our choices. The Stoics were deeply concerned with death, but not in a morbid way. They practiced what they called memento mori, remembering death, keeping mortality present in consciousness. This was not meant to darken life with gloom, but to sharpen life into focus. When we remember that our time is limited, we waste less of it. When we remember that we will die, we attend more carefully to how we live. Marcus frequently reminded himself of his mortality in the Meditations. He observed that death is natural, no more strange or terrible than birth. He noted that emperors and beggars alike return to dust, that death has claimed billions before us and will claim billions after us. He reminded himself that he might die at any moment, today, this hour, and asked himself whether he was living in a way that would make that acceptable. This contemplation of death served several purposes. First, it helped Marcus maintain perspective on his daily troubles. When you remember that you will die, that argument with a colleague seems less important. That slight to your reputation feels less devastating. That political defeat appears less catastrophic. None of these things will matter when you are gone, so why let them disturb your peace now? Second, remembering death helped Marcus appreciate the present moment. We cannot live in the past, which no longer exists. We cannot live in the future, which does not yet exist. We can only live now, in this present moment, which is all we ever truly have. Marcus reminded himself that life is not long. We do not have time to waste in anxiety, anger, or pettiness. We have time only to live well right now. Third, contemplating mortality helped Marcus remain virtuous. If you knew you would die tonight, how would you treat the people around you? Would you hold on to petty grudges? Would you pursue hollow honors? Would you compromise your principles for temporary advantage? Most likely, you would want to part from life having lived with integrity. The Stoics suggested living every moment with that same awareness, that same clarity about what truly matters. Marcus saw death not as a wall that we crash into at the end of life, but as a process occurring constantly. Every moment, he noted, something of us dies. The past is already dead. The future is uncertain. We are constantly in flux, constantly changing, constantly letting go of what was and moving into what comes next. Understanding this makes actual death less fearsome. We have been practicing for it all along, with every moment that passes, every breath that ends. For a Stoic, the fear of death is ultimately the fear of nature itself. But nature cannot be unnatural. Death is part of the process of life, as essential and as natural as birth, growth, or change. To rage against death is to rage against existence itself. Better to accept death as part of the package, to welcome it when it comes naturally, and to focus our energy on living well in whatever time we have. This does not mean the Stoics were passive about survival. They valued life as a preferred indifferent. All things being equal, living is better than dying. But all things are not always equal. There are worse things than death, the Stoics taught. Living without virtue is worse than death. Living in shame, cruelty, or cowardice is worse than death. If we must choose between life and virtue, we must choose virtue. This is what makes a person truly free. Marcus did not seek death, but neither did he fear it. He lived on military frontiers where death was common. He witnessed plague claim thousands. He felt his own health declining as he aged. Through all of this, he maintained his philosophical practice, reminding himself that death is natural, that what matters is virtue, that he should live each day as if it might be his last, not in panic but in purposeful attention. Now we must address what makes Marcus's philosophical practice so remarkable. It is one thing to philosophize in comfort, in safety, in the leisure of a garden or library. It is another thing entirely to practice philosophy while bearing the weight of an empire, while making decisions that affect millions of lives, while dealing with war, plague, and political conspiracy. The gap between philosophical ideals and lived reality challenges everyone who attempts to live philosophically. We know what virtue looks like in theory. We know we should be patient, wise, just, and courageous. But then life presents us with actual situations, with real provocations, with genuine difficulties, and suddenly those ideals seem harder to embody. The person who insulted us seems truly insufferable. The situation that frustrates us seems genuinely intolerable. The fear we feel seems entirely justified. Marcus faced this gap on a scale almost unimaginable. He believed in the Stoic ideal of cosmopolitanism, the brotherhood of all rational beings. Yet he commanded armies that killed thousands. He believed in the Stoic teaching that all people are fundamentally the same, driven by the same basic nature. Yet he dealt daily with senators who schemed against him, generals who competed for favor, and advisors who told him what they thought he wanted to hear rather than the truth. He believed in maintaining inner tranquility regardless of external circumstances. Yet he faced circumstances that would break most people. Constant warfare, political pressure, the deaths of many of his children, the burden of making decisions that would determine whether people lived or died, whether cities would stand or fall. How do you maintain Stoic equanimity in the face of such pressure? The Meditations reveal that Marcus struggled with this. He did not pretend it was easy. He did not claim to have achieved perfect Stoic wisdom. Instead, we see him constantly working to bring his mind back to philosophical principles. We see him reminding himself how to think about difficult people, not because he had mastered this teaching, but because he needed the reminder. We see him returning again and again to fundamental insights, like someone checking a compass to make sure he has not drifted off course. This is perhaps the most important thing the Meditations teaches us. Philosophy is not something we achieve once and then possess. It is something we practice daily, constantly, in the midst of whatever circumstances we face. It is a discipline, like any other discipline, requiring repetition, patience, and persistence. We do not become patient by understanding the concept of patience. We become patient by practicing patience, failing, trying again, failing again, trying again. Marcus wrote his Meditations as part of this practice. The writing itself was philosophical exercise, a way of thinking through difficulties, reminding himself of principles, working out how to apply Stoic teachings to specific situations. He was not writing for us, but we benefit from his practice because his struggles are, in essence, our struggles. The details differ, but the fundamental challenges remain the same. How do we maintain our integrity when pressured to compromise? How do we treat people justly when they do not treat us justly? How do we remain calm when everything around us is chaos? How do we focus on what matters when countless distractions pull at our attention? How do we accept what we cannot change while still working to change what we can? These questions confronted Marcus Aurelius, Emperor of Rome. They confront us still. In the segments ahead, we will move deeper into the Meditations, exploring Marcus's thoughts on human nature, on dealing with difficult people, on maintaining perspective, on living with purpose. We will see how he attempted to practice Stoicism not in abstract theory but in concrete reality. We will learn not from his perfection, which he never claimed, but from his honest effort to live philosophically despite everything that made it difficult. The silence of Marcus Aurelius, the private nature of these meditations, allows us to hear something rare. Not a teacher lecturing students, not a philosopher constructing arguments, but a human being thinking through how to live, how to remain good, how to maintain peace in a world that constantly threatens it. That voice, speaking to himself across centuries, speaks to us still. We turn now to the pages themselves, to the actual words Marcus Aurelius set down in the stillness of his tent, in the margins of his days, in the precious hours between duty and sleep. We approach these writings not as scholars examining an ancient text, but as fellow humans reading the private thoughts of someone who struggled with questions we still struggle with. Someone who held unimaginable power yet felt deeply his own smallness beneath the stars. The meditations were never meant for us. This fact cannot be overstated. Marcus did not write these reflections intending them to inspire future generations, to be studied in universities, to be quoted in books about leadership or wisdom. He wrote them for himself. He wrote them because he needed to, because the weight of empire demanded that he have somewhere to turn when the noise of the world became too loud, when the demands of others threatened to drown out his own voice, his own principles, his own humanity. Imagine him there, in the fading light of a campaign tent somewhere along the Danube frontier. The sounds of an army settling for the night filtering through the fabric walls. Marcus sits with his journal, his stylus, the wax tablet or papyrus scroll on which he records his thoughts. He is tired. The kind of tired that comes not just from physical exertion but from the constant strain of holding together a civilization, of making decisions that will ripple out across millions of lives, of maintaining composure when everything inside him wants to scream or weep or simply stop. And what does he write? Not proclamations, not imperial edicts or historical accounts of his victories. He writes reminders to himself, instructions for his own character, gentle corrections when he notices himself slipping toward anger, toward pride, toward the seductive comfort of believing his own importance. When you wake in the morning, he tells himself, think of what a privilege it is to be alive, to breathe, to think, to enjoy, to love. This is not a man drunk on power writing. This is a man reminding himself not to take existence for granted, not to let the weight of responsibility crush his capacity for gratitude. Every morning, before the petitions and the battles and the endless administrative machinery of empire demanded his attention, he had to call himself back to something fundamental, to appreciation, to wonder, to the simple fact of being. The structure of the meditations reveals this intimate, personal quality. There is no grand organization, no systematic presentation of Stoic philosophy from first principles to final conclusions. Instead, we have entries that circle back on similar themes, that approach the same problems from slightly different angles, that repeat certain phrases and ideas because Marcus himself needed that repetition. He was teaching himself, training himself, reminding himself over and over of truths that were easy to forget in the chaos of daily life. Consider what this means. The most powerful individual in the known world, a man who could have scribes record his every word for posterity, who could commission monuments and histories and philosophical treatises, chose instead to engage in this quiet, private practice. He chose to write for an audience of one, for the person who needed these words most desperately, himself. This tells us something profound about what philosophy meant to Marcus. It was not an intellectual exercise, not a matter of winning arguments or impressing others with clever reasoning. Philosophy was survival. It was the practice that allowed him to remain human in circumstances that could easily have turned him into a monster or a machine. Every tyrant, Every cruel emperor before him had faced similar pressures and responded by becoming harder, colder, more divorced from their own humanity. Marcus chose differently. He chose to remember who he was beneath the purple robes, beneath the title, beneath the immense apparatus of power. The paradox deepens when we consider what Marcus was actually doing with these writings. He was emperor, yes, but he was also engaged in perhaps the most egalitarian of human activities, trying to become better, trying to understand himself, trying to live according to principles he believed were true. In this, he was no different from the slave Epictetus, whose teachings influenced him so deeply. No different from you or me when we pause to examine our own thoughts, our own reactions, our own patterns of behavior. The Stoics believed that virtue was the only true good, and that virtue was available to everyone, regardless of circumstance. A slave could be virtuous, a beggar could be virtuous, and an emperor, despite all his advantages and all his power, had no special claim to virtue simply by virtue of his position. If anything, his position made virtue more difficult to maintain. More temptations, more flattery, more opportunities to believe himself above the rules that governed others. Marcus knew this. He felt it constantly, and so he wrote himself warnings. Do not act as if you had 10,000 years to live, he reminds himself. Death hangs over you. While you live, while it is in your power, be good. The urgency here is palpable. He is not speaking to humanity in general. He is speaking to Marcus Aurelius, who might today make a decision that betrays his principles, who might today let anger guide his actions, who might today forget that his time is limited and his character is the only thing he truly controls. This practice of writing as self-instruction runs throughout the meditations. We see him working through his frustrations with other people, the irritations that come from dealing with the ignorant, the selfish, the foolish. When you wake in the morning, he writes in one entry, tell yourself, the people I deal with today will be meddling, ungrateful, arrogant, dishonest, jealous, and surly. This is not pessimism. This is preparation. Marcus is steeling himself for the reality of human interaction, especially for someone in his position who must deal with constant requests, complaints, and political maneuvering. But notice what follows. He does not leave it there at cynical expectation. He continues, they are like this because they cannot tell good from evil. But I have seen the beauty of good and the ugliness of evil, and have recognized that the wrongdoer has a nature related to my own. He brings himself back to Stoic principles, back to the recognition of shared humanity, back to compassion rooted not in naive optimism but in philosophical understanding. This is the work. This is what Marcus was doing in these private pages. He was catching himself in moments of potential moral failure and redirecting himself toward wisdom. He was noticing his own tendencies toward judgment, toward anger, toward the privileged man's easy contempt for others, and he was correcting course. Not perfectly. He did not claim perfection, but persistently, daily, with the kind of dedicated practice that we might see in an athlete training their body or a musician training their hands. The content of the meditations reveals a man intimately aware of his own faults. He worries about wasting time, about being too concerned with others' opinions, about letting his mind become disturbed by events outside his control, about forgetting the impermanence of all things, including himself. These are not the concerns of someone who believed themselves above ordinary human weakness. These are the concerns of someone who saw clearly how easy it would be to lose himself in power, in pride, in the endless distractions that his position afforded. Let us look more closely at what Marcus understood about power itself. He had inherited an empire at its height, a vast machinery of governance, military might, and cultural influence stretching from Britain to Mesopotamia, from the Rhine to the Sahara. He commanded legions. His word was law. The Senate, once the supreme authority of the Republic, was now largely ceremonial, subordinate to the will of the emperor. In practical terms, Marcus Aurelius wielded more concentrated power than perhaps any human being before him. And what did he think about this power? He wrote, "The man who has a vaulted chamber, 1,000 servants, does he have any advantage in happiness over the man who has none of these things?" He saw clearly that external goods, even on the scale of empire, did not touch the essential question of human flourishing. The palace, the servants, the authority, none of it could make him a good person. None of it could give him peace. If anything, these things made peace more elusive. This insight seems almost impossible from someone in his position. Most people who acquire even modest power quickly come to identify with it, to feel that their authority is somehow an extension of their worth as human beings. The modern executive who cannot separate their identity from their job title, the politician who believes their position makes them wiser or more important than others, these are mild versions of a tendency that absolute power usually magnifies into something monstrous. Yet Marcus resisted this. He resisted it through constant, deliberate philosophical practice. He reminded himself repeatedly that his body would die, would decay, would return to the elements from which it came, that his fame, such as it was, would fade, that the entire Roman Empire itself would eventually crumble into dust. Alexander the Great and his stable boy were both brought to the same end. He wrote, "Death, the great leveler, did not care about purple robes or imperial titles." In the cosmic view that Stoicism encouraged, the difference between emperor and slave was so trivial as to be almost non-existent. This was not self-loathing or false modesty. Marcus was not engaging in a performance of humility while secretly believing himself special. He genuinely grasped what the Stoics taught, that the only meaningful difference between humans lies in their character, in their choices, in whether they align themselves with reason and virtue or allow themselves to be driven by passion, fear, and appetite. And character had nothing to do with circumstance. Consider what this meant for how he approached his actual duties as emperor. He could not simply resign, could not walk away from responsibility and retreat into philosophical contemplation like some comfortable aristocrat playing at wisdom. The weight was his to bear. The decisions were his to make. The consequences of his actions would affect millions. And yet, he had to do all of this without believing that the power made him special, without letting it corrupt his judgment, without losing sight of what truly mattered. This is perhaps the most difficult balancing act imaginable. To wield power without being seduced by it. To make decisions of enormous consequence while maintaining equanimity. To live in luxury while remembering that luxury is not good in itself, that it can just as easily soften and corrupt as it can provide comfort. To be surrounded by flattery while knowing that flattery is worthless, even dangerous. Marcus wrote that we should take care not to Caesarify yourself, not to be dipped in the purple dye. The purple dye referred to the imperial robes, the mark of his station. But the real warning was about internal transformation, about becoming the role rather than simply performing it, about letting the trappings of power change who you fundamentally were. How did he do it? How did Marcus maintain his philosophical center while managing an empire in crisis? The simple answer is that he worked at it constantly. The meditations themselves are evidence of this work. But we can look deeper into the actual techniques and practices he employed, the specific ways he applied Stoic philosophy to the overwhelming demands of his position. First, there was the practice of the dichotomy of control, that fundamental Stoic insight that Epictetus had emphasized so strongly. Some things are up to us, our judgments, our intentions, our responses, our character. Some things are not up to us. Other people's actions, the outcomes of events, the past, the future, our reputation, our circumstances. Marcus returned to this distinction again and again in his private writings. When faced with difficult people, with incompetent generals, with corrupt officials, with barbarian invasions, with plague ravaging his cities, Marcus had to constantly remind himself, I cannot control these external events. I can only control my response to them. This is not passive resignation. This is a focusing of energy on what can actually be changed. Rather than wasting emotional and mental resources raging against circumstances he could not alter, he directed his attention to maintaining his own virtue, his own rational judgment, his own philosophical principles. You have power over your mind, not outside events, he wrote. Realize this, and you will find strength. In the chaos of frontier warfare, in the frustration of political intrigue, in the weariness of plague and loss, this realization was his anchor. The barbarians would attack or not attack. The plague would spread or recede. But whether he responded with wisdom or with panic, with justice or with cruelty, with courage or with fear, this remained always within his power. Second, Marcus practiced what the Stoics called the view from above. He would deliberately imagine himself from a great distance, seeing his life, his empire, even the earth itself from a cosmic perspective. Think of the whole of existence, he wrote, of which you are the smallest fraction. This was not meant to induce despair or nihilism. Rather, it was a technique for maintaining perspective, for not becoming so absorbed in immediate concerns that he lost sight of what truly mattered. When some political crisis seemed overwhelming, when the stakes felt impossibly high, Marcus would step back mentally and consider how brief and small these events were in the vast sweep of time. How small a fraction of infinite and abysmal time has been assigned to each man, he reflected. For in a moment it is lost in eternity. This did not make his duties less important, but it prevented them from crushing him. It allowed him to do what needed to be done without the paralyzing weight of believing that everything depended absolutely on his success or failure. Third, he practiced deliberate remembrance of death, what the Stoics called memento mori, not as morbid obsession but as a clarifying practice. You could leave life right now, he reminded himself. Let that determine what you do and say and think. The awareness of mortality stripped away pretense. Forced honesty highlighted what actually mattered. An emperor might live in elaborate palaces, but those palaces could not protect him from death. His power could not buy him one extra day beyond what fate had allotted. This practice particularly helped Marcus deal with the frustrations of dealing with others. When someone offended him, when political enemies schemed against him, when people failed to live up to his expectations, he would remember, these people are mortal. I am mortal. Soon enough, we will all be gone, and these petty conflicts will be forgotten. This did not lead to apathy, but it prevented the kind of vindictive anger, the personal grudges, the ego-driven conflicts that had characterized so many previous emperors. There is something profound in watching Marcus work through his relationship with human nature in these pages. He is not naive about people. He sees clearly their selfishness, their irrationality, their capacity for cruelty and stupidity. He must deal constantly with betrayal, with incompetence, with people who flatter him to his face while plotting against him behind his back. As emperor, He has no shortage of evidence for humanity's darker tendencies. Yet he does not become cynical. He does not give in to the easy contempt that his position might justify. Instead, he works constantly to maintain compassion, to remember the common humanity he shares even with those who frustrate or harm him. This is one of the most remarkable aspects of the Meditations. Watching a man with every reason to become hard and judgmental instead choosing, repeatedly, to understand. When you are offended by someone's behavior, he writes, turn immediately to your own mind and ask, do I make similar mistakes? If so, how can I be angry at them? He is applying the Stoic principle that wrongdoing comes from ignorance. People who act badly do so because they are confused about what is truly good, about what will actually benefit them. They are like people who are colorblind trying to sort objects by color. Their failure is not moral corruption in most cases. It is misunderstanding. This does not mean Marcus believed everyone was equally capable or equally virtuous. He was a practical man leading a vast empire. He had to make judgments about character, about who could be trusted with responsibility, about who needed to be removed from positions of power. But he tried to make these judgments without personal animosity, without the ego investment that turns practical decisions into emotional vendettas. Consider the philosophical sophistication required here. Marcus must maintain discipline in his legions, must punish betrayal and incompetence, must sometimes be harsh in his decisions. An empire cannot function if the emperor is so compassionate that he cannot enforce necessary order. Yet he must do all of this without letting it poison his own character, without letting the exercise of power make him cruel, without losing his basic respect for human dignity. He writes, it is possible to have the attitude that all human beings are my kinsmen, not by blood or seed, but by sharing in the same mind, the same fragment of divinity. Here is the Stoic cosmopolitanism that sees all rational beings as citizens of a single universal community. But Marcus is not writing this in a philosophy classroom, surrounded by sympathetic students. He is writing it while managing an empire filled with people actively working against him, people whose incompetence costs lives, people whose moral failings create suffering for thousands. The fact that he can maintain this philosophical view under such circumstances speaks to the depth of his practice. This is not theoretical philosophy. This is not a comfortable opinion held when it costs nothing to hold it. This is a principle he must actively work to maintain against the constant pressure of his circumstances, against the legitimate frustrations of his daily experience, against the easy alternative of simply writing people off as irredeemable. Throughout the Meditations, we see Marcus reminding himself that anger is useless. Not that anger is morally wrong in some abstract sense, but that it accomplishes nothing practical and damages the person who feels it. How much more harmful are the consequences of anger than the acts that provoke it? He observes. This is wisdom born from experience, from watching himself become angry and seeing how it clouded his judgment, how it made him suffer, how it never actually improved the situation. The daily discipline of philosophy as Marcus practiced, it was not about achieving some final state of perfection. It was not about becoming invulnerable to emotion or transcending human limitation. It was about showing up again and again to the work of self-examination and self-correction. It was about catching himself when he started to slip and gently, persistently, bringing himself back to his principles. This is perhaps most clear in the repetitive nature of his writing. If you read the Meditations straight through, you notice that certain themes, certain reminders, certain pieces of advice appear multiple times in slightly different forms. Marcus tells himself repeatedly not to waste time. not to concern himself with others' opinions, to focus on the present moment, to remember that death is natural and not to be feared, to maintain equanimity in the face of circumstance. Some readers might find this repetitive, but the repetition is the point. Marcus is not trying to say something new and original each time he writes. He is reinforcing lessons he keeps having to relearn. He is addressing patterns in his own thinking that keep re-emerging despite his best efforts. He is doing the unglamorous work of actual philosophical practice, which looks more like strengthening a muscle through repeated exercise than like discovering profound new truths. Consider what this means for how we understand philosophical development. We often imagine wisdom as a kind of permanent achievement, as if once we truly grasp some important truth, we will never need to learn it again. But Marcus's practice reveals a different model. Wisdom is not a destination but a direction. It is not a state you reach but a practice you maintain. Even after years of Stoic training, even after internalizing these teachings so deeply that he could write eloquently about them, Marcus still needed to remind himself of basic principles, still caught himself falling into old patterns, still had to work at being the person he wanted to be. This should be encouraging rather than discouraging. It means that the struggle itself is not a sign of failure. The fact that you must repeatedly work at maintaining your principles, that you must catch yourself again and again when you slip into anxiety or anger or distraction, does not mean you are doing philosophy wrong. It means you are doing it exactly right. You are doing what even Marcus Aurelius, one of the greatest practitioners of Stoicism, had to do. The daily discipline also meant confronting uncomfortable truths about himself. Marcus did not shy away from examining his own faults, his own tendencies toward laziness or irritation or pride. He wrote, "At dawn, when you have trouble getting out of bed, tell yourself, I have to go to work as a human being." He struggled with the same basic resistance to effort that we all struggle with. The Emperor of Rome had trouble getting up in the morning. He had to talk himself into doing what needed to be done. This vulnerability in his writing, this willingness to show himself as someone still working on basic issues of discipline and motivation, makes the meditations profoundly human. Marcus is not writing from a position of having it all figured out. He is writing from the middle of the struggle, from the daily effort of trying to live according to his principles despite all the internal and external obstacles. He also confronted the frustration of imperfection. There is a sense in some passages that Marcus feels he should be better than he is, that after all this training and practice, he should have achieved more consistency in his virtue. But rather than giving in to self-condemnation, he redirects himself to acceptance and renewed effort. "Be content to make even the smallest step forward," he writes, "and consider that outcome no small thing." Perhaps the most striking aspect of Marcus's philosophical practice is how completely it was woven into the texture of his daily life. He was not a philosopher who occasionally had to deal with practical matters. He was not an emperor who occasionally found time for philosophical reflection. He was someone who had integrated his philosophy so fully into his experience that even the most mundane or frustrating aspects of his duties became occasions for practice. When he had to sit through tedious meetings with officials, when he had to listen to endless petitions and complaints, when he had to manage the administrative machinery of empire, he used these moments as opportunities to practice patience, to observe his own reactions, to maintain presence of mind. The boredom, the frustration, the weariness, these were not obstacles to philosophy. They were the arena in which philosophy had to prove its worth. This integration of philosophy and life is what distinguishes Marcus from many other philosophers, both ancient and modern. It is easy to develop beautiful theories when your life is comfortable and controlled. It is easy to write about virtue when you are not constantly tested. It is easy to advocate for certain principles when you are not responsible for the welfare of millions. Marcus had to practice philosophy under the most extreme conditions imaginable, and the fact that his philosophy remained consistent, remained humane, remained focused on virtue rather than power, tells us that it was genuine. The Meditations show us a man who took Stoicism seriously enough to apply it in every area of his life. When he was sick, which was often, he practiced acceptance of bodily suffering as something neither good nor bad in itself. When he was tired from campaigns, he reminded himself that he was doing his duty, fulfilling his role in the larger order of things. When he faced military defeats or political setbacks, he practiced equanimity, neither elated by success nor crushed by failure. And through it all, he kept writing, kept returning to his journal, kept engaging in this private dialogue with himself. The writing itself was a practice, a way of clarifying his thoughts, of catching his own rationalizations and excuses, of maintaining the self-awareness that Socrates had insisted was the foundation of philosophy. We might imagine that a man in Marcus's position would eventually tire of this constant self-examination, would want to simply relax into the enjoyments that his power could provide. But the Meditations suggest otherwise. The practice itself seems to have been sustaining rather than exhausting. It was not an additional burden on top of his imperial duties. It was what made those duties bearable. It was his refuge, his anchor, the still point in the turning world of politics and warfare and plague. Reading these private reflections, we realize that we are witnessing something rare. A complete human being struggling to remain complete under inhuman pressure. We are seeing the work of maintaining one's humanity when circumstances constantly threaten to reduce you to a function, a role, a mechanism of power. We are watching someone refuse to be Caesarified, to use his own term, refuse to become merely the emperor and lose the man underneath. This is why the Meditations have spoken to so many people across so many centuries. Not because they present some perfect system of philosophy, not because Marcus achieved flawless virtue, but because they show us what it looks like to try persistently and honestly to live according to principles, to work at being good, to maintain one's philosophical center in the face of everything that might pull you away from it, and to do this not as performance or pretense, but as the essential work of a human life. We have walked with Marcus through the foundational teachings of his Meditations, observed him wrestling with impermanence and duty, watched him examine human nature with unflinching honesty. Now, as we move deeper into the substance of his private reflections, we encounter something unexpected. We discover that Marcus Aurelius was not merely writing to instruct himself. He was building something. He was constructing, line by line, entry by entry, a refuge for his mind amid circumstances that would have broken most people. This refuge was not made of stone or timber. It required no physical space, no guards at the entrance. Marcus called it an inner citadel, and he returned to it constantly whenever the demands of the world threatened to overwhelm his capacity for reason. The concept of the inner citadel is one of Stoicism's most enduring images. It appears throughout the philosophical tradition, but nowhere is it rendered more personally than in the pages of the Meditations. For Marcus, the citadel was not a metaphor he admired from a distance. It was the place he actually lived. While his body stood in courtrooms, on battlefields, in marble halls crowded with supplicants and senators, his consciousness retreated into this fortified interior. He withdrew not from the world, but from the world's capacity to disturb his reason. Consider the paradox here. The most powerful man in the known world, commanding legions, administering provinces, deciding matters of life and death with a gesture, found safety not in his power but in something wholly internal. His genuine protection came not from the soldiers surrounding his tent, but from the disciplines he practiced when alone with his thoughts. He could be harmed by disease, by betrayal, by failure on the battlefield. But he could not be harmed in the thing that mattered most to him, his capacity to think well and act rightly, unless he permitted it. This is a profound inversion of common sense. We imagine that power brings security. We think that if we could only control more of the external world, we would finally feel safe. Marcus knew better. He understood that the external world is ungovernable, that fortune shifts without warning, that empires crumble and armies mutiny, and plagues sweep through populations indifferent to rank or virtue. The only security available to a human being is internal, and it must be built deliberately, maintained constantly, defended against the mind's own tendency toward panic and distraction. The inner citadel is not a place of isolation. Marcus did not retreat into it to escape responsibility. On the contrary, he retreated into it so that he could meet his responsibilities without being swept away by them. From this interior stronghold, he could act without being consumed by anxiety about outcomes. He could make decisions without being paralyzed by fear of consequences. He could face loss without being destroyed by grief. This practice required enormous discipline. It would have been easier, surely, to let the external demands dictate his internal state, to rage when things went wrong, to panic when threats multiplied, to grow intoxicated with success or despondent with setbacks. But Marcus knew that if he allowed the world to determine his mind's condition, he would cease to be truly free. He would become a puppet, dancing to strings pulled by circumstance. Instead, each day, sometimes multiple times each day, he withdrew to examine his thoughts. He reminded himself of first principles. He questioned his judgments. He separated his opinions from actual events. This was not avoidance of reality. It was the most realistic practice imaginable, because it acknowledged a fundamental truth about human experience. We never respond directly to events. We always respond to our judgments about events. And those judgments are within our control. When Marcus wrote that no one can prevent you from living according to the reason of your own nature, he was describing the inner citadel's essential immunity. External events can deprive you of wealth, health, reputation, even life itself. But they cannot force you to abandon virtue unless you consent to that abandonment. They cannot make you judge foolishly or act viciously unless you cooperate with the assault. This is not mere wordplay or philosophical abstraction. For Marcus, it was practical technology for surviving impossible circumstances. Consider his daily reality. He governed an empire perpetually threatened by external enemies and internal corruption. He managed a bureaucracy riddled with self-interest. He commanded armies led by generals ambitious for power. He adjudicated disputes among men who despised each other. He confronted pandemics, floods, famines, and revolts. The pressure was relentless. Yet in his private writings, we find not despair but steady resolve. We find a man testing his judgments, checking his emotional responses, reminding himself that virtue alone is good. The meditations reveal a sustained effort to maintain the citadel's walls against the siege of circumstance. How did he do this? Not through willpower alone, though discipline was certainly required. Primarily, Marcus maintained his inner citadel through attention to his thinking. He watched his mind. He noticed when judgments formed that attributed goodness or badness to things outside his control. He caught himself when he began to think that his happiness depended on outcomes he could not guarantee. He interrupted the automatic process by which external events seemed to determine internal states. This requires understanding a basic mechanism of human suffering. Most of our distress does not come from events themselves, but from the stories we tell about those events. We lose something and we immediately add to the loss a narrative about what it means, why it happened, what it suggests about the future. We gain something and we construct elaborate fantasies about how it will solve our problems or prove our worth. Both responses add mental suffering to the actual circumstances. Marcus worked to strip away these additions. When faced with difficulty, he practiced seeing it as it actually was, without the overlay of judgment that made it seem catastrophic. An obstacle appeared, he noted it as an obstacle. Someone betrayed him, he observed the betrayal. A campaign failed, he acknowledged the failure. But he refused to add the judgment that these things were evil, that they made his life miserable, that they justified abandoning his principles. This practice of attention is subtle and easily misunderstood. It does not mean denying reality or pretending that difficulties are pleasant. Marcus did not claim that plague and war and betrayal were good things in themselves. He recognized them as dispreferred circumstances, but he refused to grant them the power to make him vicious or unreasonable. He maintained the distinction between what happened and what he made of what happened. The inner citadel's walls were built from this distinction. Each time Marcus reminded himself that an external event could not touch his ability to think well and act rightly, he reinforced those walls. Each time he caught himself attributing his mental state to circumstances beyond his control, he repaired a breach in the fortification. The practice was constant because the pressure was constant. We might wonder whether this was psychologically healthy. Was Marcus simply suppressing legitimate emotions? Was he denying himself the normal human responses of anger at injustice, grief at loss, joy at success? This question reveals a misunderstanding of the Stoic project. Marcus was not eliminating emotion. He was transforming his relationship to it. The Stoics recognized that certain emotional responses arise automatically from our judgments. If you believe that you have lost something truly good, grief follows. If you believe that someone has done you genuine harm, anger arises. If you believe that you have obtained something that will make you happy, pleasure appears. These emotions are not separate from our thinking. They are consequences of the way we interpret events. Marcus was working to correct his interpretations at the source. Instead of trying to suppress anger after it arose, he questioned the judgment that something genuinely bad had happened to him. Instead of fighting against anxiety, he examined the belief that his well-being depended on uncertain future outcomes. Instead of chasing pleasure from external success, he recognized that true flourishing came from virtuous activity, which remained available regardless of circumstances. This is demanding work. It goes against the grain of ordinary thinking, which constantly confuses preferred outcomes with genuine good. We all know, intellectually, that wealth and health and reputation do not guarantee happiness. We have seen wealthy people miserable, healthy people anxious, famous people desperate. Yet in our own lives, we persistently act as if acquiring these external goods will finally deliver peace. Marcus forced himself to confront this confusion repeatedly. He reminded himself that the only true good is the quality of one's character and choices. Everything else falls into the category of preferred indifference, things we reasonably pursue but must not mistake for genuine goods. This distinction allowed him to engage fully with his responsibilities as emperor while maintaining the inner citadel's integrity. He could work to preserve the empire's security without believing that the empire's fate determined whether his life was good or bad. He could pursue military victory without thinking that defeat would make him wretched. He could value his reputation for justice without being destroyed if others spoke ill of him. The citadel made it possible to care about outcomes without being enslaved to them. This capacity is perhaps what we need most in a world of overwhelming complexity and uncertainty. We too face circumstances we cannot control. We too make efforts that may fail. We too encounter betrayal, loss, disappointment, and the constant pressure of responsibilities that seem to exceed our capacity. Like Marcus, we need some interior place from which we can meet these challenges without being swept away by them. The inner citadel is not built overnight. It requires sustained practice, daily attention, constant vigilance against the mind's tendency to outsource its well-being to the external world. Marcus spent decades maintaining his citadel, and still we find him in the meditations returning to the same fundamental reminders. This is not failure. This is the nature of the practice. Philosophy, for Marcus, was not a body of knowledge to be mastered once and then possessed. It was a discipline to be practiced continuously, a skill that atrophied without use, a fortress that required constant repair. Each time he wrote in his journal, he was performing maintenance on the citadel. Each time he reminded himself that virtue alone is good, he was reinforcing the walls. Each time he examined his judgments and corrected his thinking, he was defending against the siege. We might imagine that a Roman emperor would have unlimited time for philosophical contemplation. The reality was quite different. Marcus wrote his meditations in fragments, snatching moments between military campaigns, administrative duties, ceremonial obligations, and the constant demands of governing an empire. The journal's entries are brief because his time was brief. Yet he kept returning to the practice, kept rebuilding the citadel, kept withdrawing to that interior place where his capacity for reason remained inviolate. This is perhaps the most encouraging aspect of Marcus's practice for us. He maintained his philosophical discipline not in ideal circumstances but in the midst of chaos, responsibility, and relentless pressure. He did not wait for retirement or leisure or some perfect moment when he could finally attend to his mind. He built his citadel in the middle of the war. Within the inner citadel, Marcus practiced another discipline that defined his approach to philosophy and power. He practiced premeditatio malorum, the premeditation of adversity. This was not pessimism or morbid obsession with disaster. It was realistic preparation for the inevitable difficulties of human existence. And for Marcus, those difficulties were magnified by the scope of his responsibilities. The premeditation of adversity appears throughout the meditations in various forms. Marcus reminded himself each morning that he would encounter difficult people, those who were meddlesome, ungrateful, violent, treacherous, envious, and unsocial. He did not do this to cultivate resentment or justify cynicism. He did it so that when he inevitably encountered such people, he would not be shocked or thrown off balance. He prepared his mind in advance so that difficulty would not seem like an aberration but like the expected texture of reality. This practice served multiple purposes. First, it prevented the particular suffering that comes from disappointed expectations. If you expect the day to be easy and it turns difficult, you suffer not only from the difficulty itself but from the gap between expectation and reality. You waste energy on indignation, on the feeling that things should be different, on resistance to what is actually happening. Marcus eliminated this secondary suffering by adjusting his expectations to match probable reality. Second, the premeditation of adversity transformed his relationship to difficulty when it arrived. Instead of seeing obstacles as interruptions to his real work, he recognized them as the very material of his philosophical practice. A difficult person was not preventing him from exercising virtue. Dealing well with that person was the exercise of virtue. A setback was not blocking his development. Responding to that setback with equanimity and wisdom was his development. This is a crucial shift in perspective. Most of us imagine that we will be virtuous once circumstances become favorable, once the obstacles are removed, once we have time and space and resources to really focus on what matters. Marcus understood that circumstances never become ideal, that obstacles never cease, that the time to practice virtue is always now, in the midst of whatever is actually happening. He wrote that the impediment to action advances action, that what stands in the way becomes the way. This was not clever wordplay. It was an observation about the nature of virtue. You cannot develop patience in the absence of irritation. You cannot practice courage without facing something fearful. You cannot exercise justice without encountering situations that require fair dealing. The obstacles are not separate from the path. They are the path. For an emperor, this meant that every challenge of governance was simultaneously a challenge to his character. Every difficult decision, every unpleasant duty, every encounter with corruption or incompetence or violence was an opportunity to practice the Stoic virtues of wisdom, justice, courage, and moderation. The empire's problems were not preventing his philosophical development. They were providing it. But the premeditation of adversity went deeper than preparing for difficult days or challenging people. Marcus regularly contemplated his own death. He reminded himself that he was mortal, that his time was limited, that he might die today. This practice, memento mori, remembering death, was central to his philosophical life. We might expect that an emperor would avoid thoughts of mortality, would surround himself with the illusion of permanence that power seems to offer. Marcus did the opposite. He returned constantly to the fact of death, not to depress himself but to clarify his priorities. When you remember that you will die, possibly soon, the trivial concerns that normally consume attention reveal themselves as trivial. The important things, the things that actually matter, come into focus. What matters when you remember you are mortal? Not wealth, not reputation, not victory in the 1,000 petty competitions that fill a day. What matters is whether you are living according to nature, whether you are exercising the virtues, whether you are doing your duty with goodwill, whether you are treating others with justice. These things remain important whether you live for another 40 years or die this afternoon. Everything else is revealed as provisional, temporary, ultimately beside the point. The practice of remembering death was not abstract for Marcus. As emperor, he witnessed death constantly. He commanded armies in war. He saw soldiers killed in battle, civilians caught in violence, officials executed for treason. He lived through a devastating plague that killed millions across the empire, including members of his own family. Death was not a distant philosophical concept, but an immediate presence in his daily experience. Yet Marcus did not respond to this proximity to death with despair or hedonism. He did not conclude that life was meaningless or that nothing mattered. Instead, he used the awareness of mortality to sharpen his attention to the present moment and to the quality of his actions within that moment. Since time was limited, since he could not know how much remained, each day became precious not as an opportunity for pleasure but as a chance to live well. This is profoundly different from the way we typically think about mortality when we think about it at all. Modern life encourages us to postpone. We will pursue what matters after this project is finished, after we achieve a certain level of success, after retirement, after the children are grown, after circumstances become more favorable. We live as if we have unlimited time, as if death is so distant that we need not factor it into our daily decisions. Marcus knew better. He knew that death could come at any time, that assuming abundant future time was irrational, that the only life he actually possessed was happening now. This knowledge gave weight to his choices. How should I think right now? How should I treat this person in front of me? What does this present situation require of my character? These questions could not be postponed until some imagined future when things would be easier or clearer. The premeditation of death also freed Marcus from the fear of death. This might seem paradoxical. How does thinking about death reduce fear of death? But the fear of death is largely fear of the unknown, fear of something that seems alien and catastrophic. By thinking about death regularly, by examining it philosophically, Marcus robbed it of its power to terrify him. He recognized that death is natural, part of the cycle by which all things come to be and pass away. He reminded himself that death had claimed countless generations before him and would claim countless generations after. He observed that death was simply the dissolution of the compound that was his body, a return of elements to their source, no more remarkable than falling leaves or extinguished fires. What in this process deserved fear? Moreover, Marcus reasoned that death could not harm him. While he lived, death was not present. When death arrived, he would not be present to experience it. At no point would he and death coexist in a way that would allow death to do him damage. This simple logical observation helped dissolve the anxiety that typically surrounds mortality. But perhaps most importantly, Marcus recognized that fearing death was irrational because death was outside his control. Here the dichotomy of control proved its value. He could not determine when he would die. He could live wisely, take reasonable precautions, fulfill his responsibilities, but he could not guarantee himself another year or another day. Since he could not control his lifespan, making his happiness dependent on living longer was a recipe for constant anxiety. What he could control was how he lived whatever time remained. He could ensure that today, this day he actually possessed, was lived in accordance with virtue. He could make certain that his thoughts were rational, his actions just, his responses to others compassionate. Whether he lived another 40 years or died that evening, he could be confident that this day, at least, was lived well. This is the essence of the Stoic approach to mortality. Not denial, not avoidance, not desperate attempts to forget that we are finite. Instead, honest acknowledgement of our limits, and then fierce commitment to living excellently within those limits. Marcus demonstrated that such an approach was livable even under extraordinary pressure, even when holding responsibilities that most people will never face. The question arises naturally as we consider Marcus's practice. How does one actually build an inner citadel? How does one develop the capacity to remain centered while the external world makes urgent and often conflicting demands? The meditations provide an answer, not in the form of abstract instruction, but through the example of Marcus's own daily practice. We see him again and again talking to himself. He addresses himself in the second person, offering reminders, corrections, encouragement. This self-dialogue is not the rambling internal monologue that fills most minds. It is structured philosophical conversation, the application of reason to his own thoughts and emotions, the work of examining and refining his judgments. When Marcus found himself disturbed by something, He did not simply endure the disturbance or try to distract himself from it. He interrogated it. He asked himself what judgment was causing the disturbance. He questioned whether that judgment was rational. He reminded himself of principles he had previously accepted. He walked himself through logical arguments until the disturbance dissolved or transformed into something manageable. This practice requires a particular kind of mental discipline. It requires the ability to step back from your immediate reactions and observe them. It requires recognizing that your thoughts are not simply facts about reality but interpretations that can be examined and revised. It requires the humility to acknowledge when your thinking is confused or irrational. And it requires the patience to repeat these corrections as many times as necessary. Marcus was the emperor. No one could compel him to question his own judgments. If he decided something was intolerable, who would contradict him? If he chose to indulge anger or anxiety or self-pity, who would stop him? He could have lived entirely according to his immediate emotional reactions, and the empire would have bent to accommodate his moods. Yet he chose instead to submit his thoughts to philosophical scrutiny, to hold himself accountable to reason rather than allowing impulse to rule. This voluntary submission to rational examination is what distinguished Marcus from other powerful men. Power typically corrupts not through dramatic moral failures but through the gradual erosion of self-discipline. When you can have whatever you want, when no one dares correct you, when your slightest wish is instantly fulfilled, the muscles of self-restraint atrophy. You lose the capacity to delay gratification, to question your desires, to recognize that what you want and what is good might be different things. Marcus resisted this erosion through daily philosophical practice. He maintained his capacity for self-examination not through exceptional willpower but through habit. He made it his routine to write in his journal, to review his day, to remind himself of Stoic principles, to examine his judgments and correct his thinking. The practice became part of his life structure, as regular as the morning briefings and evening reports that governed his official duties. The writing itself was crucial. There is something about externalizing thoughts through writing that makes them available for examination in a way that merely thinking them does not. When you write, you slow down. You must choose words. You create a record that can be reviewed. You make your thinking visible to yourself in a way that clarifies both its strengths and its confusions. Marcus's journal entries are brief, often fragmentary, sometimes repetitive. He was not crafting literary masterpieces or composing philosophical treatises. He was working through his thinking, reminding himself of truths he kept forgetting, reinforcing mental habits that constant pressure threatened to erode. The writing was functional, a tool for maintaining the inner citadel against the daily siege of circumstance. We can learn from this. We too can develop the practice of philosophical writing, of examining our thoughts on paper, of questioning our judgments and reminding ourselves of principles we claim to hold. We do not need Marcus's philosophical training or his emperor's education. We need only the willingness to pay attention to our thinking and the discipline to make that attention regular. As we spend more time with the meditations, certain themes recur with such frequency that they reveal the particular challenges Marcus faced most acutely. He returns again and again to the difficulty of dealing with other people, to the frustration of encountering selfishness and foolishness and malice, to the temptation to retreat from social responsibility into isolated philosophical contemplation. This reveals something important about Marcus's character and about Stoicism more broadly. The philosophical life is not pursued in isolation. It is lived in community, in relationship, in the midst of social obligation and interpersonal friction. Marcus could have withdrawn from the burdens of empire, could have spent his time in peaceful study, could have surrounded himself only with wise and virtuous companions. Instead, he remained engaged with the messy reality of human society, with all its conflicts and compromises and corruptions. He did this not because he was temperamentally suited to it. The Meditations reveal a man who found interpersonal conflict exhausting, who was frustrated by others' irrationality, who sometimes longed for solitude and peace. He remained engaged because Stoic philosophy taught him that human beings are social by nature, that we are meant to work together for the common good, that withdrawing from community would be a betrayal of his nature as a rational social being. This commitment to social engagement despite its difficulties is perhaps Marcus's greatest example to us. We live in an age that often celebrates isolation, that encourages withdrawal from civic life, that treats disengagement as sophistication. We curate our social media feeds to exclude disagreement, avoid people whose views differ from ours, retreat into comfortable bubbles of the like-minded. This is the opposite of what Marcus practiced. He forced himself to remain in relationship with difficult people. He reminded himself that they too were rational beings, that their foolishness came from ignorance rather than malice, that his job was to correct them if possible and to bear with them if not. He practiced seeing others as his kin, as fellow members of the human community, as partners in the project of creating a well-ordered society even when they seemed to be working against that project. This did not mean accepting injustice or failing to correct wrongdoing. Marcus was emperor. He had responsibilities that included punishing criminals, removing corrupt officials, making hard decisions that affected millions. But he tried to perform these duties without hatred, without personal animosity, without losing sight of the common humanity he shared even with those he was forced to oppose. The practice was difficult. The Meditations contain passages where Marcus's frustration breaks through, where he seems worn down by the constant effort of dealing charitably with unreasonable people. Yet even in these moments of discouragement, he pulls himself back to his principles. He reminds himself why social engagement matters. He reconnects with the philosophical ground that makes patience and justice possible even when they are not rewarded. This pattern, discouragement followed by philosophical recovery, appears throughout the journal. It reveals that maintaining virtue was not easy for Marcus, not natural, not the path of least resistance. It was the result of continuous effort, of constant return to first principles, of philosophical practice renewed each day despite repeated failures and frustrations. There is profound encouragement in this for those of us attempting to live philosophically in ordinary circumstances. Marcus was not a philosophical superman effortlessly maintaining perfect virtue while managing an empire. He was a man struggling with the same challenges we face: irritation at others' thoughtlessness, frustration when efforts fail, weariness under the weight of responsibility, doubt about whether any of it matters. The difference was that he had philosophical practices that allowed him to work through these challenges without being destroyed by them. He built his inner citadel not once but continually, stone by stone, day by day, entry by entry in his private journal. He premeditated adversity not to master all suffering but to reduce unnecessary suffering and meet necessary suffering with equanimity. He remembered death not to become morbid but to clarify what mattered. He examined his judgments not to achieve perfect rationality but to catch his worst errors and correct his most destructive patterns of thought. We turn now to the question that naturally emerges from all philosophical reflection. How do we live this? How do we take the wisdom Marcus practiced privately in his tent and bring it into the complicated texture of our own days? The beauty of Stoic practice, and particularly the practice we find in the Meditations, is that it was never meant to be abstract. Marcus was not writing theory. He was working out how to be human under conditions of extraordinary pressure and complexity. Every reflection he recorded emerged from actual circumstances, real frustrations, genuine difficulty. This makes his journal uniquely practical. He was solving the same problems we face, only at imperial scale. How do you remain calm when surrounded by demands? How do you act with principle when expediency would be easier? How do you maintain perspective when everyone treats you as though you are the center of everything? The applications we explore now are not separate from the philosophy. They are the philosophy. Stoicism has always insisted that wisdom is not what you know but what you do. Understanding virtue means nothing if you do not practice it. Recognizing what is in your control helps nothing if you continue acting as though everything depends on external circumstances. Let us begin with the morning. Marcus often reflected on how he prepared himself for the day ahead. He would remind himself that he would encounter difficult people, people who were confused, angry, selfish, or hostile. This was not pessimism. It was preparation. We can adopt this same practice. Before the day begins, before we encounter traffic or emails or the 100 small frictions that arise in any life, we can take a moment to recognize that difficulty will come. Not as a curse, but as a certainty. People will be unreasonable. Plans will not unfold as we expect. Something will irritate us. By acknowledging this in advance, we remove the element of shock. We are not surprised when someone is rude. We expected it. Not because we are cynical, but because we understand that human beings are imperfect, that everyone is dealing with their own confusion and pain, and that we ourselves are no exception. This simple practice shifts everything. Instead of reacting with outrage at every disappointment, we meet the world as it is. We have already accepted that it will not conform to our wishes. This acceptance is not resignation. It is freedom. We stop wasting energy on indignation and redirect it toward responding well. Another practice Marcus used frequently was the view from above. He would imagine himself rising up, seeing the city from a height, then higher still until the whole empire spread below him, then the whole earth, just a small sphere turning in darkness, filled with tiny lives, each thinking their concerns the center of everything. This practice reminds us of proportion. The argument we are having, the slight we suffered, the achievement we are chasing, all of it shrinks when placed in proper context. Not because it does not matter, but because it matters only as much as it actually matters, not as much as our inflamed emotions insist it does. We can use this practice whenever we feel ourselves becoming too attached, too agitated, too convinced of the supreme importance of some outcome. We step back. We zoom out. We remember that we are very small, that our time is brief, that countless people have faced exactly what we face and found their way through. Consider the practice of negative visualization, which we have touched upon before. This is the deliberate imagining of loss. Not to torture ourselves, but to appreciate what we have and to prepare ourselves for change. Marcus often reminded himself that everything he loved was mortal, temporary, already passing away even as he held it. His children, his friends, his own life. This was not morbid. It was clarity. By recognizing the temporary nature of everything, he learned to value it properly while it lasted. We can practice this ourselves. Before we leave home in the morning, we can pause and recognize that those we love are mortal. This may be the last time we see them. Not probably, but possibly. This recognition changes how we say goodbye. We become more present, more genuinely affectionate, less distracted by our rushing thoughts. The same applies to our possessions, our roles, our health. Everything we have can be lost. not as a threat but as a fact. When we internalize this, we hold things more lightly. We are grateful for them without being enslaved to them. And when loss does come, as it inevitably will, we are not shattered. We knew this was always the agreement. Let us turn to the practice of voluntary discomfort, another distinctly Stoic discipline. Marcus would periodically remind himself that he could live with very little, that comfort was not necessary, that hardship was not catastrophic. We can introduce small doses of discomfort into our lives as a form of training. We might skip a meal deliberately, not as punishment but as practice. We learn that hunger is not an emergency. We might take a cold shower, sleep on the floor, sit in silence without entertainment. These small difficulties teach us that we are stronger than we think, that we do not need as much as we believe, that most of what we consider necessities are actually preferences. This practice builds resilience. When genuine difficulty arrives, we have already proven to ourselves that we can endure. We have broken the association between discomfort and disaster. We discover that we can be uncomfortable and still be ourselves, still think clearly, still act well. Another practical application involves our speech. Marcus frequently reminded himself to speak only what was true, necessary, and kind. He recognized how much damage careless words could cause, how much energy was wasted in gossip, complaint, and empty talk. We can adopt this discipline. Before we speak, we can ask whether what we are about to say is true. Not just factually accurate, but genuinely honest, including honest about our own uncertainty. We can ask whether it is necessary, whether it serves any good purpose or merely fills silence with noise. And we can ask whether it is kind, whether it respects the dignity of the person we are addressing. This does not mean we never say difficult things. Sometimes truth requires us to speak challenging words. But we can deliver even hard truths with respect, without cruelty, without using honesty as an excuse for inflicting pain. Notice how much of our daily speech fails these tests. We exaggerate to make stories more interesting. We complain to bond with others over shared grievances. We speak carelessly because we do not pause to consider the weight of our words. By bringing awareness to our speech, we change not only how others experience us, but how we experience ourselves. There is also the practice of reviewing the day, something Marcus clearly did as he wrote his reflections. Each evening, we can take a few moments to consider what happened, not to judge ourselves harshly, but to examine our actions honestly. Where did we respond well? Where did we react poorly? When did we allow externals to disturb our peace? When did we maintain our principles despite difficulty? This review is not about guilt. It is about learning. We are training ourselves, and training requires honest assessment. When we notice that we became angry over something trivial, we do not berate ourselves. We simply note it. We recognize the pattern. We consider what we might do differently next time. Tomorrow offers another opportunity to practice, and we approach it slightly wiser than before. This practice of evening reflection creates continuity in our development. Each day becomes part of a larger project of becoming more rational, more kind, more free. We are not starting from nothing each morning. We are building on what we learned the day before. Let us consider the practical application of the dichotomy of control in specific situations. Imagine you are facing a difficult conversation at work. Perhaps you need to address a conflict with a colleague or present an idea to skeptical superiors. Anxiety arises naturally. The Stoic approach asks you to separate clearly what is up to you from what is not. You can control your preparation. You can think through your points carefully, consider possible objections, organize your thoughts. You can control your intentions. You can decide to speak honestly, respectfully, with genuine concern for finding a good resolution rather than simply winning. You can control your delivery to some extent. You can speak clearly, listen carefully, remain calm even if others become heated. But you cannot control how they respond. You cannot control whether they agree, whether they like you, whether the outcome you hope for comes to pass. By focusing your energy entirely on what is yours to control, you enter the conversation without the burden of trying to control everything. You do your part well and accept that the rest unfolds as it will. This does not guarantee the outcome you want, but it guarantees that you will not be destroyed by outcomes you do not want. The same framework applies to creative work, to relationships, to health concerns, to anything that involves uncertainty. We distinguish ruthlessly between what we can influence and what we cannot. We pour ourselves fully into the former and accept the latter with equanimity. Consider also the practice of recognizing common humanity, something Marcus worked on continually. When someone annoys you, you can pause and remember that this person is struggling with their own confusion, fear, and pain. They are doing what they think is best given their understanding. They are not your enemy. They are another human being trying to navigate existence with imperfect wisdom. This practice does not mean you accept mistreatment. You can maintain boundaries, disagree clearly, even end relationships that are harmful. But you do so without hatred, without the toxic burden of resentment. You recognize that their behavior comes from their own inner turbulence, not from your inadequacy. We might also practice reframing obstacles as opportunities. Marcus expressed this idea beautifully. The impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way. When we encounter difficulty, our immediate reaction is often frustration. The situation should not be this way. Things should be easier. But what if we met every obstacle with curiosity instead? What is this teaching me? How is this making me stronger? What skill am I developing by working through this? The obstacle itself becomes the curriculum. Patience is learned only through situations that require patience. Courage develops only when we face what frightens us. This reframing is not pretending that difficulty is pleasant. It is recognizing that difficulty is useful. Every challenge is a form of training if we approach it with the right mindset. We stop asking why this is happening to us and start asking what we can learn from it. There is also practical wisdom in how we relate to time. Marcus frequently reminded himself that he had only the present moment. The past was gone and unchangeable. The future was uncertain and beyond his control. All he ever had was now, this moment, this choice, this action. We can bring this awareness into daily life. When we notice ourselves dwelling on past mistakes or worrying about future possibilities, we can gently return to the present. Not by forcing our thoughts, but by redirecting our attention to what is actually here. The breath moving in and out, the task in front of us, the person we are with. This practice of presence is not about denying past or future. We learn from the past. We plan intelligently for the future, but we do not live there. We live here, in the only moment we ever truly have. By anchoring ourselves in the present, we stop hemorrhaging energy into mental spaces that do not exist. Consider also how we might practice gratitude in the Stoic mode. This is not the superficial gratitude that pretends everything is wonderful. It is the deeper recognition that we have received much that we did not earn, that our existence itself is a kind of gift, temporary but real. We can take time to notice what is working, the body that mostly functions, the people who care about us, the shelter we have, the food we eat, the freedom we enjoy. None of this was guaranteed. None of it is permanent. But it is here now, and we can acknowledge it. This practice does not ignore what is wrong. It simply refuses to focus exclusively on lack and complaint. We train our attention to notice the full reality, including the good that is present alongside the difficult. This balanced awareness keeps us from the twin distortions of naive optimism and bitter cynicism. Let us also think about how we practice philosophy in relationships. Marcus knew that wisdom is tested most in how we treat other people. We can be calm in solitude. The real challenge is remaining wise when dealing with the irrationality, demands, and needs of others. We might practice listening more and speaking less, genuinely trying to understand what others are experiencing rather than waiting for our turn to talk. We might practice assuming good intentions, recognizing that most people are doing their best with limited understanding, not trying to cause harm. We can practice patience with the slow growth of others, remembering that we ourselves are still learning, still making mistakes, still far from perfect. We can practice honesty without cruelty, saying what needs to be said but with respect for the other person's dignity. These practices do not guarantee that our relationships will be easy or that others will respond as we hope. But they guarantee that we will be acting rightly, that we will not add unnecessary conflict to what is already difficult about human connection. Another valuable practice is the conscious examination of our desires. Marcus constantly questioned whether what he wanted was truly good or merely seemed good because it was pleasant. We can do the same. When we feel a strong pull towards something, we can pause and investigate. What are we actually pursuing? If we get this thing, will it genuinely make us better, wiser, more free? Or will it simply provide temporary pleasure followed by the need for more? This is not about denying ourselves everything. It is about choosing consciously, understanding what we are doing and why. Some desires align with our values and deepen our lives. Others distract us from what matters and create dependency. By examining our wanting, we become less controlled by it. We might also consider the practice of service, of contributing to the common good. Marcus understood that human beings are social creatures, that we are meant to work together, that our individual good is bound up with the good of others. We can ask ourselves regularly what we are contributing, not in grand terms, but in practical daily terms. Are we doing our work well? Are we kind to the people we encounter? Are we making the small corner of the world we inhabit better or worse by our presence? This practice connects us to something larger than our private concerns. It gives our actions meaning beyond personal satisfaction. Even small acts of helpfulness, patience, or consideration ripple outward in ways we cannot measure. We are part of a vast network of mutual dependence, and what we do matters. There is also wisdom in how we handle success and praise. Marcus worked constantly to remain humble despite being surrounded by people who treated him as divine. When we experience success, when others praise us, we can practice remembering that circumstances played a role, that others helped us, that we were fortunate in ways we did not control. This is not false modesty. It is accurate assessment. We can take satisfaction in genuine achievement while recognizing that we are not the sole author of our success. This keeps us from arrogance and from the fragile ego that collapses when praise stops coming. Similarly, we can practice equanimity with failure and criticism. When things go wrong, when others judge us harshly, we can examine whether the criticism has merit without being destroyed by it. If we made a mistake, we acknowledge it and learn. If the criticism is unfair, we recognize that others' opinions do not define our worth. All of these practices share a common foundation. They require us to pause, to create space between stimulus and response, to choose consciously rather than reacting automatically. This is the heart of Stoic practice, the cultivation of rational agency, the development of our capacity to direct our own minds. Marcus practiced this every day, in the midst of enormous responsibility, surrounded by people who expected him to be more than human. He did not always succeed. He recorded his frustrations, his struggles, his need to remind himself of the same principles again and again. But he kept practicing. Day after day, situation after situation, he worked to align his actions with his principles. Not perfectly, but persistently. This is what we can learn from him most of all. That wisdom is not a destination but a practice, not an achievement but a discipline, not something we attain once but something we return to continually. The applications we have explored are not meant to be adopted all at once. They are possibilities to experiment with, practices to try one at a time, approaches to test against your own life and circumstances. Some will resonate immediately. Others may become meaningful only later, when you encounter the particular difficulty they address. What matters is not mastering every technique but engaging with the larger project. Becoming more conscious, more intentional, more free. Each practice is a tool for this work. We use what helps and set aside what does not, always with the understanding that philosophy is personal, that it must be lived to be understood, that reading about wisdom is not the same as practicing it. Marcus knew this intimately. His journal exists because he practiced daily, because he worked through his difficulties on the page, because he reminded himself constantly of what he knew but kept forgetting. We honor his example not by memorizing his words but by doing our own work, writing our own reflections, facing our own challenges with the same commitment to wisdom he brought to his. We have traveled through the private thoughts of Marcus Aurelius, following the path of a man who held absolute power yet sought nothing more than wisdom and peace. We have read his journal entries, composed in moments stolen from the demands of empire, and found in them not the voice of a conqueror, but the quiet reflection of someone trying, day by day, to live well. His words were never meant for us, yet they reach across centuries with remarkable clarity, speaking to the same human struggles we face in our own lives. The journey through the meditations reveals something essential about philosophy itself. It is not a destination we arrive at, not a state of perfection we achieve and then maintain effortlessly. Philosophy, as Marcus practiced it, is the daily work of returning to what matters, of remembering what we are and what we are not. Each morning he began again. Each evening he examined his day. The emperor who commanded legions submitted himself to this gentle discipline, this constant practice of attention and awareness. What strikes us most deeply, perhaps, is the gap between what Marcus possessed and what he valued. He had wealth beyond measure, yet he wrote about the emptiness of material things. He commanded armies, yet he reflected on the futility of domination. He could have demanded flattery and obedience, yet he chose to remind himself of his own insignificance in the vast sweep of time. This is the paradox at the heart of his philosophy. The man who had everything recognizing that he needed very little. The man who could control the fate of millions understanding that true control extends only to his own thoughts and responses. In his tent, writing by lamplight after long days of warfare and governance, Marcus was doing something quietly revolutionary. He was refusing the seduction of power. He was declining the invitation to believe himself exceptional, divinely appointed, beyond the reach of ordinary human limitations. Instead, he wrote himself back down to earth, back to the fundamental reality that he too would die, that his accomplishments would fade, that his true worth lay not in his title but in the quality of his character and the integrity of his choices. This practice of humility was not self-denial or false modesty. It was clear-sighted recognition of reality. Marcus understood that power is temporary, reputation is fragile, and external circumstances are always beyond our complete control. What remained within his grasp was his capacity to respond with reason, justice, courage, and moderation. These virtues, the four pillars of Stoic philosophy, became his anchors in the storm of imperial responsibility. Throughout the meditations, we encounter a mind in conversation with itself, questioning, correcting, encouraging. Marcus is not proclaiming truths to an audience. He is reminding himself of what he already knows but easily forgets. He writes about patience when he is impatient, about kindness when he is frustrated, about acceptance when he is resisting reality. The very act of writing becomes a practice of attention, a way of bringing his mind back to the principles he has chosen to live by. We see in these private pages the full humanity of philosophy. Marcus struggles. He grows tired. He faces disappointment and loss. He deals with difficult people and impossible situations. He questions whether his efforts matter. Yet he continues the practice, returns to the discipline, renews his commitment to living according to nature and reason. This persistence is itself a teaching, showing us that philosophy is not about achieving a permanent state of serenity, but about the willingness to begin again, moment by moment, regardless of how many times we have fallen short. The silence of Marcus Aurelius, that quality of inner stillness he cultivated amid the noise of empire, was not the silence of retreat or withdrawal. It was the silence of deep attention, of listening to reason rather than the clamor of desire and fear. In that silence, he found the space to choose his responses rather than react automatically. He found the clarity to distinguish between what matters and what merely seems urgent. He found the strength to carry his responsibilities without being crushed by them. As we integrate the teachings we have explored together, certain themes emerge with particular force. The dichotomy of control, that fundamental Stoic principle, runs through every page of the meditations like a golden thread. Marcus returns to it again and again. Some things are up to us and some things are not. Our opinions, our impulses, our desires, our aversions are within our control. Everything else, the whole vast world of external circumstances, truly lies beyond our power. This distinction sounds simple, almost obvious, yet living by it requires constant practice and attention. We spend so much energy trying to control what cannot be controlled. We worry about outcomes that depend on factors beyond our influence. We become angry when reality refuses to conform to our preferences. We suffer not only from what happens, but from our belief that things should be different than they are. Marcus understood this pattern and worked deliberately to free himself from it. He practiced accepting what comes with equanimity, focusing his efforts on the only thing he could truly direct: his own faculty of choice, his capacity to respond with virtue. This practice of acceptance is not passive resignation. It is the active recognition of reality as it is, which then allows for wise and effective response. When Marcus faced the plague that swept through his empire, he could not control the disease itself. When he dealt with rebellious generals and incompetent officials, he could not control their characters. When he confronted the mortality of those he loved, including his own children, he could not prevent death. But he could control how he met these challenges. He could choose courage over despair, reason over panic, compassion over bitterness. The inner citadel, that fortress of the mind that no external force can breach, became Marcus's refuge and strength. Not a place of escape, but a place of return, where he could reconnect with his principles and remember his true nature. In that inner space, he was not emperor but simply a human being, subject to the same cosmic laws as everyone else, possessing the same capacity for reason and virtue as any other person. This recognition both humbled him and liberated him. His power was not what made him valuable. His humanity was. Throughout our exploration, we have seen how Marcus applied philosophical principles to the practical challenges of his life. He dealt with difficult people by reminding himself that we are all part of the same whole, that we are made for cooperation, that even those who frustrate us are doing the best they can with their current understanding. He faced his responsibilities by breaking them down into the present moment, never carrying the weight of the entire future, always focusing on what could be done right now. He confronted mortality by keeping it always in view, not as something morbid, but as the truth that gives life its preciousness and urgency. The memento mori practice, the remembrance of death, appears throughout the meditations not as pessimism but as clarity. Marcus reflects on how brief life is, how quickly we pass from the stage, how foolish it is to waste time on resentment, vanity, or trivial concerns. This awareness of mortality does not darken his outlook. It illuminates what matters. Each day becomes precious precisely because it is finite. Each interaction holds weight because opportunities for connection are limited. Each choice to act with virtue becomes significant because we have only so many such choices before we are gone. What makes Marcus Aurelius so accessible to us today, across such a vast distance of time and culture, is precisely his humanity. His struggles are our struggles. His questions are our questions. He wondered if his work mattered, and so do we. He dealt with frustration and disappointment, and so do we. He tried to be patient with difficult people, and so do we. He wanted to live with integrity even when it was hard, and so do we. The specifics of his life were extraordinary, but the inner experience was deeply, recognizably human. Philosophy, as Marcus practiced it, was not an intellectual exercise but a way of life. It was not something he studied in order to know more, but something he practiced in order to live better. This distinction is crucial. The Stoics did not measure philosophical progress by how many concepts one could explain, but by how one actually lived. Did philosophy make you more patient, more just, more courageous, more moderate? If not, then it remained merely theoretical, disconnected from life where it matters most. The meditations show us philosophy as a daily discipline, a practice taken up each morning and returned to throughout the day. Marcus began his days by preparing himself mentally for what he would encounter. Difficult people, frustrating situations, unexpected challenges. He reminded himself of his principles before he needed them, so they would be available when circumstances demanded them. This proactive approach to philosophy, this anticipation of difficulty and preparation of response, is the practice of premeditatio malorum, the premeditation of adversity. By imagining challenges before they arrive, we reduce their power to disturb us when they come. We have already met them in thought, already considered our response, already decided what virtue requires. This is not pessimism but practical wisdom. Marcus knew that obstacles would arise, that people would disappoint, that plans would fail. By expecting these as normal features of life rather than as surprising aberrations, he maintained his equilibrium even in difficulty. Reality could not shock him because he had already accepted that reality includes hardship. Yet this acceptance of adversity coexisted with genuine joy and gratitude. Marcus was not a grim ascetic, forcing himself to endure a joyless existence. He wrote with appreciation about the simple pleasures of life, the beauty of the natural world, the satisfaction of useful work, the warmth of human connection. He recognized that while external things are indifferent in the technical Stoic sense, meaning they are not necessary for virtue, many of them are nevertheless preferred and enriching. The key is holding them lightly, enjoying them when present but not being destroyed by their absence. This concept of preferred indifference helps us understand Marcus's relationship with his role as emperor. Power, wealth, and status were indifferent in that they did not make him a better or worse person. Virtue alone determined his moral worth. Yet these external things could be used well or badly, and Marcus tried to use them well. He preferred to have resources he could use to help people rather than to lack such resources. He preferred to have influence he could exercise justly rather than to have no ability to affect circumstances. But his peace of mind did not depend on maintaining these things. If they were taken away, his inner citadel would remain intact. We have explored how Marcus dealt with the weight of responsibility, how he carried the burden of empire without being crushed by it. His method was to break everything down into the present moment. What needs to be done right now? What virtue does this situation call for? He did not carry the past as regret or the future as anxiety. He met each moment as it came, did what reason and justice required, and then moved to the next moment. This radical present focus is not avoidance of planning or ignoring consequences. It is the recognition that we only ever act in the now, so that is where our attention must be. The question of legacy appears often in the Meditations. Marcus reflects on how quickly even the greatest names are forgotten, how empires rise and fall, how everything in the material world eventually dissolves back into the elements. These reflections might seem depressing, but for Marcus they were liberating. If fame is so fleeting and remembrance so uncertain, then we are freed from the tyranny of reputation. We can do what is right simply because it is right, not because it will be praised. We can live with integrity for its own sake, not for the reward of eternal memory. This perspective on fame and legacy connects to the broader Stoic understanding of human nature and cosmic order. Marcus saw himself as a small part of a vast whole, a brief moment in an infinite process of change and transformation. He was born, lived for a time, and would die, returning his elements to the universe that loaned them to him. This was not tragic but natural, not something to resist but to accept as the way things are. In accepting his place in the natural order, Marcus found peace. He was not fighting against reality but cooperating with it, living according to nature as the Stoics advised. For a human being, living according to nature means living according to reason, exercising the rational faculty that distinguishes us from other creatures. It means acting with the social virtues, recognizing our fundamental interconnection with all other people. It means accepting change and impermanence as the natural state of all material things. It means aligning our will with the way things actually are rather than insisting they conform to our preferences. The practice of philosophy that we see in the Meditations is both gentle and persistent. Marcus does not berate himself harshly when he falls short of his ideals. He does not demand perfection or despair when he finds himself still struggling with the same difficulties. Instead, he patiently returns to his principles, reminds himself of what matters, and begins again. This quality of patient persistence is perhaps one of his greatest teachings. Progress in philosophy is not linear or dramatic. It is the accumulation of small efforts, the daily practice of attention and intention, the gradual formation of better habits of thought and response. We have seen how Marcus dealt with anger, that emotion the Stoics identified as particularly destructive to peace of mind. He did not simply suppress his anger or pretend not to feel it. He examined it, questioned its basis, considered whether it served any useful purpose. He reminded himself that other people act from their own understanding, that they are not deliberately trying to harm him but are pursuing what seems good to them. He practiced seeing their actions as the inevitable result of their characters and circumstances, not as personal affronts requiring his indignation. This reframing of others' behavior did not excuse wrongdoing, but it removed the emotional sting that anger adds to our experience. Similarly, with grief and loss, Marcus worked to accept the natural course of things. He lost children, friends, colleagues, mentors. He faced these losses not by denying his sorrow, but by placing it within the larger context of natural change. All compound things dissolve. All living things die. This is not a defect in the universe, but the way the universe functions. To rage against mortality is to rage against nature itself, which is both futile and contrary to reason. Better to love what we have while we have it, knowing it is temporary, and then to let it go when the time comes with gratitude for what was rather than bitterness about what is no longer. The wisdom we find in Marcus Aurelius is not esoteric or mystical. It is practical, grounded, focused on how to live well in the everyday circumstances of human life. He teaches us to pay attention to our thoughts, because thoughts generate emotions and motivate actions. He teaches us to distinguish between what we can control and what we cannot, so we direct our efforts wisely. He teaches us to remember our mortality, so we do not waste time on what does not matter. He teaches us to act with justice, courage, wisdom, and moderation, because these virtues are the components of good character and the foundation of a well-lived life. What we take from our time with Marcus's private thoughts is not a set of rules to follow mechanically, but a sense of what philosophical practice looks like. It is personal and intimate, adapted to one's own circumstances and challenges. It is ongoing, a daily practice rather than a one-time achievement. It is honest, acknowledging difficulty and struggle rather than pretending to have transcended human limitations. It is humble, recognizing that we are all works in progress, all learning, all capable of improvement regardless of where we currently stand. The silence of Marcus Aurelius, that inner stillness he cultivated, is available to each of us. It does not require withdrawing from life or avoiding responsibility. It is found in the midst of activity, in the pause between stimulus and response, in the moment when we remember our principles and choose our reaction rather than being carried away by automatic emotion. It is the silence of attention, of presence, of awareness. In that silence, we hear reason speaking, guiding us toward what is truly good. As we come to the close of our time together with Marcus Aurelius, we find ourselves not at an ending but at a threshold. The teachings we have explored are not meant to be passively received and then set aside. They are meant to be lived, practiced, integrated into the fabric of our daily existence. Marcus wrote his meditations for himself as reminders and encouragements, as tools for his own philosophical practice. We have read over his shoulder, learning from his private discipline, and now the question becomes, what will we do with what we have learned? The beauty of Stoic philosophy is that it requires no special circumstances to practice. We do not need to be emperors or philosophers by profession. We need only to be human beings facing the universal challenges of human life. We all encounter difficulty. We all deal with other people. We all face loss and change. We all must make choices about how to respond to circumstances we did not choose. In these common situations, the wisdom Marcus practiced becomes our own resource, our own guide. The practice might begin simply as it did for Marcus. Perhaps we start each day by taking a moment to remember our principles, to consider what challenges might arise and how we wish to meet them. Perhaps we pause before reacting to difficulty, creating a small space in which we can choose our response rather than being carried away by immediate emotion. Perhaps we examine our day in the evening, noticing where we acted in accordance with our values and where we fell short, not to judge ourselves harshly but to learn and to recommit. Over time, these small practices accumulate. They shape our habits of thought and response. They strengthen our capacity to maintain equilibrium even in challenging circumstances. They deepen our understanding of what truly matters and what does not. We begin to experience the peace that Marcus sought, not as the absence of difficulty, but as the presence of clarity and purpose amid difficulty. We discover that we have more control than we thought, not over external events but over our own minds, and that this control is precisely where our freedom and power actually reside. The paradox of Marcus Aurelius continues to speak to us because it reflects a truth about human existence. We live in circumstances we do not fully control, yet we have the capacity to respond with wisdom and virtue. We are small and temporary, yet we can live with dignity and meaning. We will die, yet we can make our lives matter through the quality of our choices and the integrity of our character. This is the human condition, the same for emperors and ordinary citizens, the same across centuries and cultures. Marcus faced his human condition in extraordinary circumstances, with the added weight of imperial power and responsibility. Yet his response was fundamentally the same as what is available to any of us. The practice of philosophy, the discipline of attention, the cultivation of virtue, the acceptance of what is beyond our control, and the careful stewardship of what lies within it. His journal shows us that this practice is never complete, never perfected, but always available to be taken up again. As we rest in these final reflections, we might notice a quality of quietness settling over the thoughts we have shared. This is not the silence of conclusion, but the silence of integration, the pause in which wisdom moves from words into understanding, from concepts into felt sense. The teachings of Marcus Aurelius do not need to be grasped tightly or memorized perfectly. They need only to be allowed to settle gently into awareness, where they can inform our living without our constantly attending to them. The philosophical life is not separate from ordinary life. It is ordinary life approached with attention and intention. It is breakfast eaten with awareness. It is work done with purpose. It is relationships engaged with patience and goodwill. It is difficulty met with courage. It is loss accepted with grace. These are not extraordinary acts, but common moments transformed by the quality of consciousness we bring to them. In this spirit, we let the words and ideas rest. We have traveled through the private thoughts of a Roman emperor, found there a human being struggling and aspiring just as we do, and discovered that his ancient practice remains fresh and relevant. What he wrote in his tent by lamplight reaches us now, across vast distances of time and space, because truth does not age and wisdom does not expire. The meditations remain alive because they speak to what is always true about human existence. Let these reflections settle where they will, finding their place in your own understanding, informing your own practice in whatever way serves your journey. The silence of Marcus Aurelius, that inner peace he cultivated so carefully, awaits each of us in the stillness beneath our thoughts, available whenever we pause and remember who we truly are.